Hi everyone, and welcome back to Coffee with Kirsten. We're flying through the Old Testament here, and we have made it to wisdom literature. What is wisdom literature? Well, it comprises the book of Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Wisdom literature seeks to give practical advice on how to live in a godly manner. So it's not theoretical, it's not like a doctrine to be applied. It's all really practical advice that is given based off of what else is said in the Bible. A word of warning with wisdom literature, it's really, really, really important to read it in its context. All of the wisdom literature books are written a little differently, but they all have the same end goal, right? Is to teach us how to live practical, godly lives and what that looks like. But each of them kind of is written a little differently. But they all seek to teach us how to live good lives. So let's start with the book of Proverbs. Last time we talked about the book of Psalms and how they are poetry and they are full of hyperbole and exaggeration. And they have these specific literary devices. The same can be said for the book of Proverbs. They are short, pithy, or concise statements that point to a truth, right? So a lot of the time they don't come out and say it, but they point to a bigger idea. So a lot of the time it's easy for us to take them out of context and to not get the whole big meaning. But they are meant as like old wisdom, right? And we have a couple of these sayings in our culture, right? Don't put the cart before the horse, which is a more memorable way of saying do things in order, right? Don't go ahead of yourself and make sure you're doing things in the proper and correct way. It's a lot easier to remember these short statements. And these are wisdom that should be given by parents to kids, for example, right? Like, look both ways before you cross the street. They all are really practical. And they are all meant to give you a really practical guide on how to live a God-honoring life. It's really important that we don't take these out of context. It's really easy to just quote the 2 lines. Most of the Proverbs are 2 lines or 4, right? They're really short and it's easy to pull them out of their context. But when we do that, we can get into some really dangerous water, especially with Proverbs. I'm going to say it once because it sounds like Proverbs will guarantee your success if you follow them. That is not true. Right? Nowhere in the Bible does God ever promise that you are going to be successful. The idea of Proverbs is you are more likely to be successful if you follow these God-honoring principles, right? They point to a broader idea that isn't stated in the short little 2 sentences, right? We can't cover everything. So Proverbs are pretty easy to understand, right? But remember to take everything in its cultural context. These were written for people to remember in ancient Israel. So some of them talk about stuff like it's better to live on a flat roof than with a wife who's arguing with you. And that's hard for us to understand because we don't live in flat roof houses anymore, right? And that is saying it's better to live in a garage than it is to marry too hastily to a person who isn't the right fit. Is actually what that's trying to say. These are where translations come in, different Bible translations. NLT, right? Those that are a little more descriptive in language are great for reading the Proverbs because they try to put them in modern language. So remember everything in its context. And Proverbs are what we call proverbial wisdom, right? That makes sense. Short statements. The other book of wisdom literature, right? The books are made up of a different kind of wisdom called speculative wisdom. Now, speculative wisdom doesn't seek to give us really concrete answers, but seeks to tackle big questions, right? Take Job, for example. Job takes the philosophical idea of suffering and seeks to try and break it down in a memorable way. Job, when we read it, we have to be really, really careful. Job needs to be read from start to finish in one sitting, right? With Job, we have to be really careful about taking things out of context. Job is written as a discourse, a conversation between Job and his comforters, people who are helping him through the grieving process. Although his friends all have the wrong idea. They say things that are counter to godly wisdom. If we read Job, it's really easy to get the idea that God punishes those who sin and bad things happen to bad people. But if you behave correctly, then you'll never suffer, right? Suffering is brought on by yourself. But that's not true. Job argues against that. But if we don't read everything in its context and remember that it's trying to tackle this big idea, we end up in a really, really dangerous place. So Job seeks to talk about how God, while sovereign, doesn't have control over everything, right? God doesn't, start these bad things. He's not punishing you, right? But Job seeks to tackle that huge idea of suffering, and it does that through a story. Now, Job kind of bookends. It begins and ends with the major ideas. So with wisdom literature, see what ideas are repeated at the front and the back of the story. Ecclesiastes is the same way. This is a really hard book to read, and I don't recommend just reading it on your own. I really, same with Job, I encourage a study Bible with this one because it's really easy to get the wrong ideas, and it seems really contradictory to what else is said in the Bible. And if something is contradicting something else in the Bible, then we need to take a pause and see what's going on and look into the context. Ecclesiastes is written from the teacher's perspective, talking about how everything is vanity, right? It's a really negative book. And there's a lot of conversations that go on in the scholarly world about if this is a book to illustrate how we shouldn't live our life, that we shouldn't be really negative, or if it's saying that we should appreciate what we have when we have it, but that death is the ultimate end goal. With Ecclesiastes, it's really important to remember that the author didn't have the New Testament, right? They didn't have the hope in the end of Christ, right? They didn't have that final goal yet. So a lot of the hope and despair we need to read in the context of the New Testament, right? We need to remember that the story, the narrative has grown since then. And Ecclesiastes just is written in a difficult way, but the end goal of Ecclesiastes is that you need to follow God's commandments and fear, right, or love and honor God. That's the ultimate goal of Ecclesiastes. But it's a tough read. It's Job and Ecclesiastes are a little rough, and they take some thought to think out and to kind of really get the whole idea. I recommend going through studies of them, though, because they offer a lot of, what does it look like to live in suffering and to live in a world that is broken. The last book of wisdom literature is the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs. And this is a poem that is written about what a God-honoring marriage looks like. So a lot of people joke, because it's a little steamy, right? It writes about stuff that in our culture is really private and you shouldn't be talking about, right? It talks a lot about sex and body anatomy, and it freaks a lot of people out. But we need to remember the context, right? Wisdom is practical ways to live, and Song of Solomon outlines what a godly marriage looks like, right? Marriage is a good thing, right? It was meant for us by God. So the people of Israel need an example of what godly marriage looks like. And that's really important because remember, in that time and context, and even today, godly marriages do not match what secular marriages look like. The same was in ancient Israel, right? Monogamous relationships where both partners were valued was not really the cultural norm. So Song of Solomon seeks to provide a practical way for marriage. And it's an important part of the Bible, right? A lot of people won't read it because they're like, Kirsten, it's poetry. It's a little too much for me. And I get that. But remember, all of God's word is important and it seeks to provide an understanding for us. So that's all the book of wisdom literature. A lot of people consider the book of James in the New Testament as wisdom literature as well, but that was written in Greek, and if you've taken any kind of class on Greek literature, it's very different from Hebrew literature, and it reads a little more like how we talk about wisdom lit now. So that one's pretty straightforward. So wisdom lit, practical advice that needs to be read in context. If you take nothing else away from this video, context. It's really easy to misinterpret the Proverbs and the book of Job and Ecclesiastes. It's not hard to miss the point of Song of Solomon. I recommend for today the book of Proverbs. They are short and they're grouped together, so often it'll repeat the same idea. And they're fun to read because they're short and they're a little easier to tackle on your own. Proverbs 31 is an exaggerated look on what a godly woman looks like. But have fun with it, enjoy, and get that practical advice. We only have one more section of the Old Testament, and we will be back on Tuesday because Easter is on Sunday, which is very exciting. But we will be talking about the prophets to close out the Old Testament. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks so much, guys. Have a great day.